and the Chinese to trade there on a yearly basis, but really tried to control what they allowed in and out of the country. And because of that, they had been kind of cut off on all these changes that were taking place. And it's not to say that they were completely unaware of these changes that were taking place outside of their nation, but they hadn't allowed those changes in. And so that's kind of where Japan was at the beginning of this era. And so the United States is going to show up on the coast of Japan under Commodore Matthew Perry. He's going to show up with the U.S. fleet in 1853 and basically force Japan to open up to trade. And Japan, similar to what happened to China, is forced to accept these unequal treaties. First with the United States, who forces them to open up 2 ports to trade with the U.S., and then other countries get involved as well and force Japan to open up to trade and kind of controlled the trade out of those ports. And so Japan was in a very similar situation to what China was in. However, Japan was much more successful at making the needed changes in order to modernize and industrialize and ultimately rid themselves of those unequal treaties. And so first off, we're going to see an end of the Tokugawa shogunate. And the emperor begins to build up his power again. And groups of samurai kind of rebel against the Tokugawa shogunate and support the emperor. And they're going to be armed with kind of leftover surplus weapons from the U.S. Civil War. And they're going to use those weapons to defeat the Tokugawa shogunate. And so this ushers in a period of Japanese history known as the Meiji Restoration. And so under the Meiji Restoration, the emperor is restored to power. And this is one of the few periods of Japanese history where the emperor actually did have power. And so power is given to Mutsuhito, or as he's known, the Meiji, the Enlightened One, and he's going to build up centralized power and abolish the old shogunate. So under the Meiji era, basically in a single generation, Japan is going to catch up on all of this missed technology and industrialization and modernization that they had missed because of that self-imposed isolation. And they're going to bring in foreign advisors to help them. They're going to create Western-style constitutions and Western-style education systems. We're going to see a social revolution take place from 1873 to 1876, where they abolished the old feudal order and abolished the old idea of daimyo and samurai. And so daimyo and samurai are going to lose status. Their class system is abolished. Samurai were issued bonds to help kind of cover their losses, but a lot of these bonds were worthless in a very short amount of time. And so this left many samurai poor and without money. And so some samurai chose to rebel, but these rebellions were quickly put down by the new modern army. Some samurai, however, were successful at transitioning, and they're going to go into businesses and create Western-style companies. In fact, a good example of this is Mitsubishi. Mitsubishi gets their start by building railroads in Japan. They're also going to create a new tax system. And the old way of collecting taxes was mostly through grain taxes that would be collected from the daimyo. This new tax system created a fixed money tax that was more reliable and brought in a more reliable source of income for the central state. They're also going to change the way they assess taxes. And instead of assessing taxes on what was actually produced on the land, they assess taxes based on what the land should produce, on the potential of the land. And so what this meant was that only the most productive people could afford to keep their land, because if you weren't maximizing the production of your land, then you were paying too much in taxes. And so it led to a more productive system of agriculture as well, because you had to show that you could produce on your land, otherwise you couldn't afford to keep it. They also created a constitutional government. This was known as the emperor's gift to the people. Now, the emperor kept central authority, and we still had limited rights on the common people, and fewer than 5% of the total adult male population could actually vote, but they do create this constitutional government. And it included a legislature called the Diet. This was kind of again, an assembly that came together and could kind of make suggestions and influence local affairs, but really didn't have a whole lot of power in the central state. We're also going to see some changes to the economy. And Japan was very successful at industrializing. However, very similar to Russia, this wasn't a natural industrialization. It wasn't, for the most part, through capitalist ventures. This happened from the top down. Again, the government kind of forced the country to industrialize. And it started with things like transportation, the railroad industry. We're going to see an expansion of telegraphs and steamships as well. We see improvements to education. We see universities spread, and a lot of their education system is going to focus on science, and also loyalty to the state remained extremely important as well. And some industries were privately owned, especially things like textile industries, but the government controlled many of the heavy industries. And in fact, we're going to see the creation of these zaibatsu. And these zaibatsu were basically government-controlled corporations, industries. And they would kind of get these industries going and get them successful and profitable. And then some of them they would sell off to these ex-samurai families and ex-daimyo families who could buy these zaibatsu and take control of them. And so overall, Japan was very successful in industrializing. However, it came at a cost. And the main cost was on the peasants. Huge land taxes could cost peasants up to half of their total crop yields. And this provided most of the state income. And peasant uprisings spread a little bit, but the government was very quick to crush those uprisings. And overall, the government just didn't do a whole lot to alleviate the suffering of the peasants. So overall, in a single generation, Japan is going to become this great industrial power. And by the end of this era, they're able to rid themselves of those unequal treaties that plagued China. And they kind of show their successful industrialization and modernization in two key wars at the end of this period. First off, they're going to defeat China in the Sino-Japanese War in 1895. This was a conflict between China and Japan for influence in Korea. And so as a result, Japan is going to increase their influence in Korea and actually annexes Korea in 1910. The second key victory was the